The village of Harvina, northern Hungary, 1890. In those days, the village of Harvina was a rather large settlement. There were about 50 families living there. Everyone lived in friendship, socializing, farming, gathering crops from the fields. But one day babies started to disappear in the village. At first the villagers could not understand who could steal their children and why someone would do that. The children's parents were heartbroken over such a loss. A year later, it was early fall, evening was falling. A crowd of people were walking along the road along the houses. Some of the people were carrying axes, some had guns, some were walking with a torch. They were all walking at a brisk pace toward a house that stood at the edge of the village, a little apart from the others. In that house lived an elderly woman named Marika. Everyone in the village knew her, and many people went to her for help when someone they loved began to get sick. Marika gave different infusions and herbal teas, made amulets for protection from evil spirits. People at that time were very superstitious. Kind and sympathetic was a woman. Everyone loved her in the village. About 3 years ago, Marika's husband died. They had no children, and she was left alone. The woman bore this grief very hard. She did not leave the house for days and nights. The light in the windows of her house stopped burning. She completely withdrew into herself, became angry and unfriendly with people. People said that Marika began to come at night to the cemetery, to the grave of her husband, and conduct there some rituals to raise him from the dead. At first the villagers were lenient to such rumors, because she was a woman of age, and her mental balance was shaken by grief and loneliness. Marika began to go to the forest of Brandevere and spend a long time there. Sometimes her hikes lasted for a whole day. She always returned from the forest exhausted and very thin. Residents who saw all this became uncomfortable, and in their heads began to arise various questions, and then the babies began to disappear. One day, local men went to the forest to hunt wild boars. They walked for a long time, but there were no traces of animals at all, and the birds had disappeared somewhere. They reached the Brandevere marshes. There were some dead trees there, and everywhere there was impenetrable swamp and bumps covered with moss. They said that people accused of witchcraft had been drowned there 100 years ago. Suddenly, one of the hunters shouted, "Look!" pointing his finger in the direction of the marshes. About 50 meters from solid ground in the swamp, there was a small moss-covered island with no vegetation except for a couple of rotten trees. In the center of the islet stood a wooden statue. A terrible ancient deity was depicted in its guise. At the top, at the level of the head of the statue, decapitated black roosters were tied on the sides. Judging by the brown, dried sweat, the whole idol was covered with blood. Near the statue of this, the deity, by a small fire, with his back to them, sat Marika on her knees. She mumbled something inarticulate, louder and louder as the devil's chant grew louder and louder. She lifted the already dead infant above her, arms outstretched, and shouting her last words, threw the little body into the fire. The flames flew high up, sparks flew in different directions. The smoke from the fire began to drift on the ground, covering the whole island. All this spoke of one thing. The ancient deity was accepting a sacrifice. The hunters were terrified, and one of them, the younger one, could not control himself and screamed. Marika turned at the scream and saw 3 men running away from the swamps. The witch rummaged through her cloth knot tied around her waist. She took out a small handful of some powder. She whispered incantations in an unknown language and blew on the palm of her hand in the direction of the fleeing hunters. A cloud of powder flew into the air. A wicked smile played on the witch's face. "Run, run, you worthless tribe. This forest won't let you go," Marika said.